All right, let's get this screen sharing worked out.
There we go. And I will remind you, if you have questions, just put them in the chat and we'll save them towards the end or relay them on to Will right then.
And I'm okay with interruptions if that's easier. I can't, the way my screen's laid out, I'm not able to really see the chat very easily. So
okay,
it'll work out best if they're just relayed whenever you choose. All right, so as John said, I am Will Bottoms. I am the Vice President of the Triad Orchid Society based in Greensboro. And I'm also a student judge with the American Orchid Society. And so I should know a little bit about orchids, I guess. I will admit that I don't grow all kinds of orchids, as there are many, many, many different kinds, and there are some that I flat out can't grow. So I'm not necessarily the all-around expert on all different types, but I will talk about the most common things you'll see around for sale and answer questions as I'm able. So as I said here, this is Orchids in Our Culture, and almost everything you need to know to grow orchids at home. So we'll start by defining this group of flowers. What is an orchid? Basically, there are a few different characteristics. The family Orchidaceae contains over 30,000 species. That number seems to go up every time I look it up. The largest, or possibly the second largest of flowers, it depends on how you count the numbers of species in the daisy family, the aster family. They're right there together, kind of vying for first place. Evolutionarily, though, orchids are significantly older than most other flowers you'll see around. It's a very old flower morphology, and they first developed around 85 million years ago. So they're fairly primitive plants overall. The most easily distinguishable factor in determining whether you're looking at an orchid or not is that orchids, as a general rule, there are a few that don't, but as a general rule, they are characterized by a fusion of the male and female flower parts into one structure that is called the column. So let's talk about flower parts as well, because it's another easy way to identify an orchid. Orchids, like all flowers, contain different parts that open successively on the flower. So the outer ring in the bud are the sepals. Inner ring are the petals. Orchids will contain a dorsal sepal at the top there, 2 lateral sepals at the bottom. Petals are the large structures there on the right and left. Column is right in the middle under the letter C. And the third petal is actually a modified structure called a labellum or lip. So I chose a Phalaenopsis to show you the basics, and then we'll look at other orchids we'll talk about so you can see kind of how these change a little bit. So this is a Cattleya, and Cattleyas, you'll have the dorsal sepal there at the top, just as in Phalaenopsis. Petals on either side, column in the center, lateral sepals there at the bottom, and in the middle, the lip. So very similar to what you saw in the Phalaenopsis. And then we'll change things up a little bit and look at a Pathia petalum flower. If you know what you're looking at, this is all the same structure. Dorsal sepal at the top. Column is there in the middle. Columns and paths are covered by that big white and pink shield there. It's called the staminode. Labellum at the bottom. Labellums and Pathiopetalums are modified into a slipper shape. They're slipper orchids. Lateral sepals and paths are fused for the most part, and they will present as one single sepal called the synsepal in the back of the flower, and then petals on either side. So kind of a breakdown of the flower parts. When you're looking at your orchids, you'll know how to identify different parts of the flower. If you're ever confused about which ones are the petals, which ones are the sepals, turn it around backwards. Look at the back of the flower. The sepals will be on the outside and the petals will be on the inside of what was the bud before it opened. Other thing we'll talk about is how orchids grow. So there are two different, and there are a few others, but two main types of growth in orchids. The first is sympodial, meaning they grow along a rhizome in successive growths. The second is monopodial, meaning there's a single growth point where the plant grows up out of that single growth point. These monopodial orchids will occasionally put off offshoots that will also grow continuously up. But for as a general rule, the growth pattern is up instead of across the media. And so as you can see from a sympodial orchid on the left, they have a rhizome where the roots come down and the pseudobulbs grow up. Pseudobulbs in orchids contain the nutrients, water, all of the part of the plant that stores things for growth. From that, there'll be a leaf, sometimes multiple, depending on what type of orchid it is. And then the flower, generally speaking, will be terminal, meaning it will produce a flower spike from the top of the pseudobulb. There are a few that grow flower spikes from the rhizome or from the base of the pseudobulb, but as a general rule, they're terminal spikes. So they'll come out of the top. And once that pseudobulb flowers, it will not reflower, generally speaking. And as you can see, new growth continues on in the direction of the growth pattern. Monopodial orchids, as I said before, single growth point from the center, roots come down, leaves go up. And so these orchids, generally speaking, do not have pseudobulbs. So they have a diminished capacity to store water and nutrients, which is important when you talk about watering. And as you see there, flower spikes will generally emerge from along the growth as it goes up, and it can alternate on either side. It depends on, how it's feeling that time of year, I guess, as to where it's going to flower, but how far up the plant will flower. They will occasionally also flower from the center in a terminal spike. And if that's the case, once that flower spike has died from the center, they will no longer continue growing from that central growth point. They could still produce offshoots from the side, but that plant has outlived flowering. It may continue to grow to survive, but it won't continue to grow. All right, so let's talk about different types of orchids you'll find around and how to take care of them. So Phalaenopsis are by far the most common plants that you'll find on the general market for purchase. They're available pretty much everywhere, grocery stores to garden centers nowadays. These are members of the Vandaceous Alliance. They exhibit monopodial growth, so they'll grow up from a central growth point. Originating in the Southeast Asia and Oceania region, almost all are epiphytes, meaning they grow on trees. Orchids are not parasitic as a general rule. They're not taking anything from the tree itself. They do parasitize a fungus that they all require to germinate, and some require to continue growth after they have germinated. But generally speaking, they're not parasites on the plants on which they grow. Phalaenopsis do not have pseudobulbs, so they do not have a large capacity to store water. They have thick, fleshy fans of leaves. This is the only place they can store water, so it's a good cue as to how the plant is doing health-wise to look at the leaves on a Phalaenopsis. They should be wide and ovoid, thick and fleshy. They shouldn't be floppy or feel mushy. So they're noted for their large, round, moth-shaped flowers. However, if you look at the different species that are available, as well as a lot of the different hybrids, especially in the breeding nowadays, you will see flowers that exhibit much more of a stariform shape, like the one you're looking at here. This just depends upon the species in the background that were used in the breeding of these plants. They were grown for years as that big round moth-shaped orchid, and now people are looking to other species to do different lines of breeding and create different interesting hybrids to grow and enjoy. Flower spikes will emerge between the leaves near the base of the plant. Spikes sometimes can grow as long as 2 feet before they will flower. And again, this will just depend on the species that you're looking at. Some spikes in Phalaenopsis will grow for years and years and produce a few flowers at a time over the course of a few years. Other spikes will grow one time, flower, and then die. And again, that's all dependent upon the species that are in the background of the plant that you purchase. Basic cultural requirements, and all of the slides are organized the same way. So we'll talk about light first. That'll be the pattern throughout the rest of the talk. Phalaenopsis are fairly shaded growers, especially in a greenhouse where it gets a lot hotter than in your house. So that's around 1,000 to 1,500 foot candles. In a greenhouse, you're looking at 65 to 75% shade cloth or thereabouts. In a home, an east or a west facing window with a sheer curtain. And that curtain is there to prevent direct sunlight through the window at any time from burning the plant. Also, you'll notice every single slide where I talk about light will have the comment at the bottom, don't forget the dark. So most orchids are photosensitive and need a distinctive photo period to grow properly. While they will grow regardless of whether or not there's an outdoor light or another light over top of them all the time, they will grow best given the chance to turn off and turn on with the day and night cycles. So if there is a large light outside of the window that you're growing them in, it may not be the best place to put them. Or if you're in a kitchen window and you leave your kitchen sink light on all night, also not the best place to put them. Water. So watering often will depend on what media you're growing in. If you're in 100% sphagnum moss, you'll water less often. If you're in a bark mix, you'll water more often. It also depends on the pot. Plastic pots will retain water for longer. Clay pots will wick water away faster. So it's really hard to tell you how often to water. A good rule of thumb, though, is roughly weekly in the summertime, roughly bi-weekly every 2 weeks in the winter. One thing that you will learn over time as you grow orchids is how to determine by the weight of the pot whether or not you need to water. And it's just one of those things that you can't really teach. You just learn from experience. Oh, my plant's dry because I can pick it up real easily, or oh, it needs another week or two because it's really heavy. You want to water Phalaenopsis when the media is approaching dryness. Generally speaking, Phalaenopsis that you'll grow in your home will not want to dry out completely. Those grown in a greenhouse can take a little more drying because the humidity is a lot higher. Always at the bottom of water, you will see the same comment here, water thoroughly, soaking the media through and allowing the water to drain through the pot. So this doesn't mean you can put an ice cube on top of the orchid or you can set it under the sink for 30 seconds. You really want to give it a good drench so that water's pouring out of the bottom of the pot. All of the media gets wet all around. If you have to turn the pot to the different sides of the pot to get it all wet, and then to let it drain thoroughly. So if the orchid is potted inside of a pot that does not drain, that is not going to be good for it long term. Some of those pots have a plastic pot inside you can pull out. Definitely always water with the pot pulled out so that it can drain, and then put it back in its display pot if that's how you purchased it or how you choose to display it. I generally don't recommend, though, ever leaving an orchid in a pot with no drainage and expecting it to do very well for very long. Temperature. So with Phalaenopsis, it's pretty easy. If you're comfortable, they're going to be comfortable too. Typically 70 to 80 during the day, somewhere around 60, 65 at night. Nighttime's a little cooler than most people like it around here, but that's what they prefer. If you're finding that you have a plant that doesn't bloom, Phalaenopsis, generally speaking, are seasonal bloomers. So they'll bloom once a year, and they get their cue for blooming based on temperature changes. So something you can do to help initiate flowering is in the autumn when the nights are cooling down, you can leave the window open next to them or put them out on your back porch, somewhere they're protected so that they don't get rained on or anything like that while you're doing this. And also don't let them get too cold. So between 50 to 55 degrees at night, those temperatures can help them to have that temperature cue to say, oh, it's time for me to flower. And this might help you get flowers on a plant that you've had for a while that hasn't flowered. People also often ask, when I buy an orchid in the store, I want to buy one that has a bunch of buds that haven't opened yet so I can enjoy it for the longest. But when I bring it home, a lot of those buds will fall off. So most likely, temperature is the culprit. Sometimes ethylene gas or your natural gas heating systems will do the same thing, or a draft from an AC vent, but temperature is almost always the #1 cause of bud blast, causing the buds to fall off before you can enjoy them. And there's just no way around it. You can't manipulate your environment to match the environment they were in. And it's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is. Humidity, relative humidity between 50 and 80%. So that seems really high to have in your house, and it is, but you can cheat in your house by using humidity trays and also by grouping plants together. So humidity trays, just a tray of rocks, water in the tray so that the plants sit on the rocks and the water doesn't touch the plant. That can help to keep the humidity up. Also, keeping plants closer together can also help with that. One thing I'll say about that, though, is if you get a pest problem, you will transfer pests really quickly. So it's always good to make sure that you quarantine any new plants somewhere else, making sure they're pest-free before you introduce them to the rest of your orchids, or really any houseplants. It's a good practice. Also, don't forget air movement. A fan in the room or even just a little fan next to the plants can really help with respiration regulation. It also will prevent molds and funguses to a degree from forming on the plant. And so the next group of orchids we'll talk about are Cattleyas. Many of you may recognize Cattleyas as the corsage orchid. They've kind of fallen out of favor nowadays, but for many years they were grown specifically to adorn people in corsages in the US and other parts of the world. The Cattleya Alliance are sympodial growers, so they grow along a rhizome. They originate in Central and South America as epiphytes and lithophytes, meaning on trees and on the rocky ground sometimes. They have thick, fleshy pseudobulbs, so they have a much greater capacity to store water than a Phalaenopsis would. Typically, the leaves are lanceolate, bright green to green yellow. They're grass green, that's about as dark as you want to see a Cattleya leaf, generally speaking. So while you think of those corsage orchids like you saw in the last slide, other Cattleyas will also have that same stariform shape that the Phalaenopsis breeders are going for nowadays. And so again, trends change, different things fall into fashion and out of fashion, just like they do in the actual fashion world when it comes to orchids. And so you'll see breeding for all of these different things take different trends throughout the years. Flower sizes in Cattleyas vary greatly. So you're looking at plants as small as 2-inch flowers to dinner plate size, larger than 8 inches. Flower spikes generally emerge from the juncture of the leaf and the pseudobulb, so they're terminal, like I said before. Very few Cattleyas do exhibit spikes coming out from the rhizome, but I think there's only one species that does that, maybe two. When properly grown, a Cattleya will produce a new flower on every growth that grows. So with light, Cattleya is much brighter than Phalaenopsis. They're grown in bright, diffused light, 3,000 to 5,000 foot candles in a greenhouse, 50 to 60% shade cloth at most, in a home, a south or west facing window. Less of a need for a shear here. And again, don't forget the dark. With Cattleyas, #1 reason they're not going to flower is because of light. Most people don't, even in a window, have enough light to provide a Cattleya with the light that it'll need to grow. I recommend, and I actually do, take my Cattleyas outside for the summer and let them grow under a tree in some dappled shade and bring them back in for the winter. Water, again, growing in sphagnum, you'll water less often. Growing in bark, you'll water more often. If you're trying to grow Cattleyas, I don't recommend sphagnum as a general rule. But if you do, I recommend you put it in a clay pot because Cattleyas want to almost fully dry out. So much drier than a Phalaenopsis when it's time to rewater again. And the same rules apply with watering. Thoroughly soak the media, allowing it to drain through the pot, and then put it back where you're growing it. Temperature, Cattleyas grow a little warmer than most of us like it, I should say. 75 to 85 during the day. Some can tolerate temperatures as high as the upper 90s. In the night, 55 to 60. So you'll notice a much greater swing in temperature there. Cattleyas experience this in their environment, and this will also help them to know when to flower. It's not as significant a requirement for Cattleya flowering as it is for Phalaenopsis. In hot summer months, you might need a shear to help keep the temperatures down, but again, in a window, it's not going to burn from the sunlight most of the time. I'd be surprised unless you have direct afternoon sunlight pounding in the window, you shouldn't see any sunburn from your Cattleyas. And again, temperature from buying one in bud to bringing it home is the most likely cause of a bud blast. Humidity, relative humidity, again, 50 to 80%. All the same rules apply. Grouping plants together, humidity trays, and having lots of air movement. Cattleyas, as I said, like to dry out more than Phalaenopsis, so greater air movement is possible. You're not going to dry them out too fast. Even if you're watering twice a week, because they get dry so fast, that's still okay, as long as they go through a wet, dry cycle before you water them. Next group are the Paphiopedilums. They are members of the Cypripedium Alliance, and you may recognize that name from some of the native slipper orchids we have in North Carolina. Cypripediums also have sympodial growth, meaning they'll grow along a rhizome. When the plant comes up, they will produce a flower spike from the center, bloom, and then that growth will no longer flower again. Native Cypripediums are ephemerals. They'll come up in the spring, flower, and then die off by the end of the fall. The Asian varieties that we grow in the orchid world and the South American varieties tend to not follow the same pattern. They'll leave their growths up for years, even though they're not flowering over and over again. Paphiopedilums originate in Southeast Asia and Northwest Oceania. Almost all are terrestrials. There are a few epiphytes and a few saprophytes and lithophytes. Saprophytes meaning they grow in rotting leaf litter in the forest, not really on the ground. Fan-shaped leaf growth. Some are solid colored, some are mottled. Depending on the breeding, you'll run across both. They have thicker, hairy brown roots. The most distinguishing feature for Paphiopedilums are their large slippers, the pouch-like labellums, and then that fused lateral sepal where the dorsal is one half and the synsepal is the other half. They don't exhibit three sepals. Flower numbers will range from a single flower on each flower spike to as many as 8, sometimes a few more. Flowers will emerge from the center of new growths, and most will only bloom once a year, but the flowers can last several months. And paths are less seasonal flowers, so that you might actually have new growths that will flower more often once you have a well-grown established plant. So in light terms, paths similar to Phalaenopsis will grow in diffused light, 1,000 to 2,000 foot candles. In a greenhouse, 60 to 70% shade cloth. In a home, east or west facing windows with a sheer curtain. And again, photosensitivity, so don't forget the dark. They like to have a little rest every day, just like us. Water. Growing in sphagnum, you'll water less often, and in bark more often. This is going to be the same throughout. Water when the media is approaching dryness. So again, approaching dryness like a Phalaenopsis, they will require to have more water in the media because they do not have pseudobulbs to hold water. And they really should never fully dry out. As always, water thoroughly, allowing water to drain through the pot. With Paphiopedilums, you even may choose to have a little saucer of water for the plant to sit in after you've watered it. And when I say little, think about the lid of a yogurt container, not a typical plant tray. So just a touch of water left so that as it dries in the pot, it can wick some water up and dry the plant out more slowly. Temperature, just like Phalaenopsis, if you're comfortable, paths are comfortable, 70 to 85 during the day, 55, 65 at night. Most Paphiopedilums, but not all, can survive temperatures into the low 40s as long as they also have low humidity. So they're going to be pretty okay if your greenhouse power goes out sometimes. It just depends on how the humidity works as well, and the breeding for the species in the background. And again, just like everything else, temperature is going to be the #1 cause of you losing your buds. So when people successfully flower orchids, I always tell them, once it starts to initiate the flower spike and you see buds forming, don't move the plant. Let it continue where it is until the flowers start to open, and then you can move it for display once most of the flowers are open. That way you don't lose anything, or you lose the least possible. For humidity, paths, again, 50 to 80%, humidity trays and grouping plants together. All of these rules will apply to all orchids. Generally speaking, relative humidity is the same for most orchids unless you're growing them in a way that is not in a pot. If you're growing them mounted, they'll need more humidity because they dry out faster. And again, don't forget air movement. It's really easy to think these guys live on the ground, so they're not going to get the same kind of breezes that orchids live in the trees do, but that's just not the case. They still like a lot of air movement, helps them out, help them to go through their wet, dry cycles. And the final group of plants that you'll commonly find for sale are Oncidiums. So members of the Oncidium Alliance, they exhibit sympodial growth, so along a rhizome, and they also have pseudobulb structures to hold water and nutrients. So these plants originate in Central and South America and the islands. Almost all are epiphytes. Very few grow as lithophytes. I can't think of any terrestrial species, but I could be wrong. They will produce large, rounded, fleshy pseudobulbs, except for the Tolumnias. The Tolumnias do not have pseudobulbs. All other Oncidiae do. Thin, wiry white roots, very different from other orchids we've talked about so far that have thickened, more fleshy roots. So they are noted for producing flower spikes that have many, many flowers on a single inflorescence, sometimes branching and having multiple flowers coming off of all sides of the flower spike. The spikes can grow as long as 5 feet in some species as they're flowering. Flower spikes will generally emerge from the base of pseudobulbs, and they will bloom multiple times per year with proper culture. I am not great at Oncidiums. I know how to grow them, but I can't seem to make them like my conditions. So I will say that up front, and I'll tell you how it's supposed to be working, but I'm not the person to tell you how to do it properly. So light, again, bright diffuse light, much like Cattleyas, 3,000 to 5,000 foot candles, or in a greenhouse, 50 to 60% shade cloth in a home, a south or west facing window. And again, you're probably not going to see sunlight burn with an Oncidium. Most of them grow fairly bright, so you won't need a shear unless it's a really hot day to prevent some of the temperature that might cause a problem. And again, photosensitivity, don't forget the dark, let them rest. Say it again, watering in sphagnum, you'll water less often and in bark more often. I do find that most people, when I see people who grow Oncidiums well, do not grow in sphagnum moss. I'll see a lot of them come in sphagnum moss, especially out of Hawaii, because that's what they use more often there. But most successful growers that I know around here don't use it, or use very little sphagnum in their mixes that they use. It's mostly bark mixes that I'll see used. And also a note with the bark mixes for Oncidiums, and really any orchids, you can sort of think about how big your bark should be by how thick the roots are. So a thicker root, you can go with bigger bark, thinner roots, smaller bark. And that's to help with water storage in the pot so that the plant can take up the maximum amount of water before it dries out. Water when the media is nearly dry. Most Oncidiums, not all, but most, do require significant drying between waterings. So a lot of them will get their water from like humidity in the air, even where it condenses on the plant. They'll soak it up and then it's dry the rest of the day. Do your research on Oncidiums, find out what you have, find out what's in the background, because some plants do require drier or even fully dry winters. And that will depend on the species in the background. Most that you'll find commonly available in grocery stores will not be those types of plants. But if you're somewhere that has interesting orchids, definitely ask questions, definitely do research, because as I said, there are some that require fully dry winters with no water. Temperature. Most Oncidiums like it fairly warm. The Odontoglossum group are not most Oncidiums. They grow in significantly cool environments, cooler than we're used to living in. So they're not great for home growers, but most Oncidiums will tolerate growth in the home, especially near a window where it's warmer during the day than it is in your room. But they'll do best, again, moving them outside for the summer, as you do with Cattleyas. So you're looking at 75 to 85 during the day, 55 to 60 at night. These temperature swings are important for flowering, but they will still flower without significant swings in temperatures. Consistent growing temperatures can help them flower multiple times. So if you can provide a consistent environment throughout the year, that can help them with the flowering more than once per year. Again, do research, because if you get a plant that has specific cooler requirements, it's really important to know that. The one picture here, a Phalaenopsis, those generally do grow cooler and wetter than other Oncidiums. And the Odontoglossum group, as I said, are nearly what I would call a cold grower. So this is one of the Odontoglossums in this picture here. Relative humidity for Oncidiums, a little lower, 40 to 60%. Again, using humidity trays to keep humidity up around plants, grouping plants together, and air movement. As I said with these guys, they like to dry out fully, so air movement is very important. So let's talk quickly about repotting. You may hear this idea that orchids like to be pot bound. They don't. They like to grow where they grow in nature, but to make them live where we want them to live in our homes, we have to force them into environments that they wouldn't normally grow in, which is where this idea of being pot bound came from. And it's not necessarily wrong. Part of what it does is it encourages things to dry out faster because there's less media to hold on to water. So if you think about it that way, it's actually a good strategy for the most part. You want to repot only when necessary. So what are the necessary reasons? Well, either the plant mass, especially the part in the pot, the roots in the pot, have outgrown the pot itself, or the media has broken down enough that it's holding more water than it needs to for the plant's health. This translates roughly to every 2 years. But again, that's not a hard and fast rule. So I can't tell you exactly when the time to repot is, but I can tell you that if one of these things is happening, you've got large root mass or you've got really nasty old stinky media, it's time to repot. So you'll carefully remove the pot away from the plant, carefully pulling off any potting media. With plants like Phalaenopsis that have fairly tender roots, Phalaenopsis and Paphipetalums, you want to kind of be carefully pulling things away, rinsing it off with a gentle water pressure. Plants that have more sturdy, stiff roots like Oncidiums and Cattleyas, their roots tend to be a lot stiffer, and you can actually take higher pressure garden hose and blow through them to get the media to come out. It's a lot easier than sitting there with your fingers and just picking little bits and pieces off of everything. Get them as clean as you can. check the roots. Anything that is dead, you'll know because it is going to be soft. It will, healthy orchid roots kind of feel like your finger. They'll have some give on the outside, but they'll be firm in the middle. Dead orchid roots don't feel that way. There's no give. There's all give and no solid in the middle. You may find that on a long Phalaenopsis root, the bottom half is dead, but the top half is fine. That's great. Cut off just above the dead part. You may find that the whole root is dead. Cut it off as close to the base of the plant as you can. The point is to get rid of anything that's dead, because if you're putting dead material back into your pot, you're introducing opportunity for rot. Select a pot that is large enough to grow for 2 or 3 years in. And again, this will just depend on how often you like to repot, and also what pots you've got available. I always run into the problem that I need a pot that I don't have. And so I find ways to make a pot smaller. So with Cattleyas especially, I'll put a lot of stuff in the bottom of pots, packing peanuts and stuff to make the pot smaller space-wise and trick the plant size and pot size to match. Firmly hold the plant in the pot while you're potting. You want to keep the plant in the middle. With a monopodial orchid. With a sympodial orchid, like a Cattleya, you'll pull the oldest growth to the edge of the pot so that it can keep growing into the bigger part of the pot that's available to grow in. You want to hold it as still as you can and pack the media in so that you can get as much around the roots without any air pockets that are significantly sized. You don't want to have a big dead space of emptiness in the middle of a pot. You want to get everything down in there as best you can, tucking it in, gently but firmly packing it down. I had a mentor a long time ago who used to tell me, if you have a newly potted orchid and you water it in and you turn it upside down, it shouldn't fall out of the pot. I don't try that because that's just not true, but he was well known for being somebody who could pack an orchid into a pot without it tipping out. And that was always his gag with people, is that he would flip his pots upside down to show you that his plants aren't moving. Ensure the plant is anchored in the pot, especially with sympodial orchids. You want the rhizome to be at the media surface. So the media is kind of around it and cushioning it, but not really covering it. And you can do this by using a rhizome clip or putting stakes in the pot to tie the orchid to. Stakes will also help with monopodial orchids. You can put a stake on either side that will hold them in place temporarily. And the reason you don't want them to move too much in this right after repotting is that any new root growth that comes out, if it's moving in the pot, wobbling around, you're going to have a chance to break off the new roots. And once the root is broken, it will no longer grow. So the root tip is the only part of the root that will continue to grow. That's basically the end of my culture talk. I will kind of put some brief shout outs to the AOS. If you're considering learning a lot about orchids and want to become a judge, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. I will not tell you it's easy, but it's definitely something fun to do. And definitely inquire. I'll be happy to answer questions if John can share my email, and I'll be happy to answer questions about the judging program and about our society as well. Also, join the AOS. I'd be remiss in not saying that it's a great organization. There's a lot of benefits, including a great monthly publication, Orchids Magazine. You'll get that both in print and digital, or you can choose an all digital format and not receive an email if you don't want to have the hassle of the mail coming in. You'll get on-demand access to all the webinars and greenhouse chats, and there are many, many, many with a lot of interesting topics to choose from. And you'll also get access to Orchid Pro, which is the encyclopedia of all of their awarded plants and flowers. It's a great resource. And also, if you're interested in learning more about our society, we are the Triad Orchid Society. You can find us on Facebook. And that's pretty much what I've got. So without anything else, there's questions or comments or...
Well, someone was asking about, the typical grocery store orchids. You bring them home, they flowered, and then drop. How long before it reblooms? And what's the best care for it?
Yeah, so most of those orchids that you're going to find in the grocery stores are Phalaenopsis. So they'll be these guys. And Phalaenopsis almost all Phalaenopsis species flower in the winter, late fall to early spring. And as a general rule, the ones you're going to find in grocery stores are going to flower on the same type of cycle. So if you have a plant that you bought in May with flowers on it, it may not flower again until the winter or even the next year's winter. Because what happens with these grocery store orchids is that they are forced into blooming at the time they want to sell them, right? So they have these massive greenhouses, and they'll have one greenhouse for each month of the year, and they'll force the temperatures in one greenhouse to give them flowers, because I said they're temperature initiated spikes. So they'll change the temperature so that the plants are tricked into thinking it's winter, put out their spike to start growing. And then this is January's greenhouse for flowers. This is February's, this is March, this is April. And that can cause problems with reflowering on a regular schedule, because the plant now has to get reacclimated to what's really happening outside and in your home, because your home changes just like the outdoors does. And so it can take sometimes longer than a year before you'll see flowers again. But as long as the plant leaves are healthy, it will still flower at some point. And again, the best way to trick Phalaenopsis into flowering is the third bullet point here. In the autumn, crack that window, put them on your back porch in a protected area, let them get cool at night, probably no lower than about 50. And that can help them say, oh, it's time for me to flower.
Another question was about once it's finished blooming, can the stalk be cut back?
Yes. So with all orchids except Phalaenopsis, the answer is absolutely yes. As close to the part where the stalk comes out of the spike comes out of the plant as you can. With Phalaenopsis, you've got two options. So the first option is cut it off. I always default to cutting off flower spikes, because if I do that, the plant is no longer focused on keeping that part of the plant alive that isn't necessary anymore. And it will put in more energy into growth and be able to flower hopefully better the next time that it flowers. Now, if you just want to have flowers in your house all the time, the other option is to look at the spike. Most Phalaenopsis spikes, will be kind of arching, and the flowers will come, in this part of the spike. If you count back from the end of the flower head, so wherever the last flower is, count back 2 nodes, and the nodes are just little bumps along the stem. Cut just above that second node back, and you may, as long as you keep the plant watered and keep it in the right conditions, you may see a branch form off of the spike to have new flowers come. It doesn't always work, but it can. I've seen people who, share pictures of, this is the 3rd time my plant has flowered off of this same spike. And that's great if what you care about is having the flowers. If you want a healthy plant, though, I recommend cutting off the spike as low as you can, and letting the plant recover, because, flowering is hard on the plant. Takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort. And so they need time to recover to really put out a good showing next year.
So someone was asking us, saying about they put their orchids outside during the summer, but they love it, but so do the ants. Are there ways to keep the ant, so when you bring it in, it's like you don't have mass exodus happening in your house?
So I am not the biggest fan of chemical mediation, for obvious reasons, with, all the plight of the bees and everything. But ants are the one thing that I just can't stand being in my plants, and I can't stand having to deal with them when they come back in the house, because they're just a nightmare. So I do generally use like the outdoor ant baits, and I'll just put them around in a few pots that are outside, because if I get them in the house, I will never be able to conquer them again. It just seems like I can't get rid of them for the entire year till they go back outside again. So yeah, that's one thing. Those and slugs get murdered. But other than that, generally speaking, I don't have terrible issues with bugs. And there are, products like neem oil that can help you with fighting mites and fighting scale and mealybugs. But if you use neem, be careful in the sun. Neem will cause your plants to burn, and direct sunlight. So make sure the neem is fully dried and removed from the plant before you put them back in the sun.
Someone was asking when the Triad Orchid Society meets.
Actually, our next meeting is Sunday. So if you head to our Facebook page, all of our meetings are on Facebook. I think I have them out through June right now, maybe. We don't always have the topics posted until things are set in stone. So for example, this coming Sunday, we're going to be talking, having Tom Etheridge, who's with the Pacific Northwest Judging Center, talk about Dracula orchids. You might have heard them referred to as monkey-faced orchids, but they're some cooler growing, really funky, interesting species from South America. And we meet every second Sunday, except for May, when we meet the third Sunday because of Mother's Day. And those meetings are regular society meetings. So we have speakers, or we'll host webinars from the AOS. And then every fourth Saturday, we also do a show and tell meeting where our members bring problem plants or talk about plants they grow really well. People ask questions. And those meetings kind of tend to be more of a catch up and chit chat conversation style than they are actually presentations. We will do presentations every now and then, but usually that meeting is more of a, here's this cool plant, here's how I grow it, or here's this plant I can't get to flower, what do I do?
Someone was asking about any nursery around the Triad with lots of orchid selections. And I will say, once we open back up, we'll start bringing in the orchids again, obviously. It's been a bummer not being open.
Yeah, it's difficult. Orchid greenhouses that are not able to compete on a commercial level are really, really suffering and have been for probably 10, 15 years now. The nearest place that I know of with a good selection is Seagrove Orchids. In Seagrove, North Carolina. Linda Thorne is a great grower. She's been doing this for many, many years. And she's got a great selection of different and cool and funky stuff, but also Phalaenopsis that you'll see in the grocery store. So she's got a little bit of everything. That's the closest place I can think of off the top of my head. If you're looking for like terrestrial orchids, you can put in the ground in your home, at your house. Plant Delights in or near Raleigh has some great terrestrials. They've also got other, not cypripediums. They've got some calanthe and other genera of orchids that you won't find everywhere. There's also at the farmers market in Asheville, a company called Jesse Israel, and they work with some local growers in the mountains that produce orchids every now and then. They kind of release them slowly so that you don't always find them, but they generally have something sometimes. So I've gotten the one terrestrial native orchid I've gotten to actually overwinter and come back is in my garden right now from there. So
someone's looking for the Joe Biden orchid that was bred by the Orchid Trail.
Oh, that would be tough to find. If it was bred by Orchid Trail, it must have been a fairly recent. Did you say Joe or Jill?
Jill.
Jill.
Jill Biden.
So if it was bred by Orchid Trail, because they went out of business like this year or late last year. I know Chadwick and Sons in Virginia typically does the First Lady orchids. So it may actually be something that they originated. And if that's the case, then you might be able to find it through them. But Orchid Trail is defunct, and I'm not sure if they have an operation that took over that's up and running yet from them. So
let's see. So what does it mean when a leaf starts to shrink, even slightly wrinkly?
That leaf is probably dying. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant is in bad health. So with Phalaenopsis, orchids that grow monopodially, so they grow up from the center, the lower leaves will eventually die off as the newer leaves are growing. So those bottom leaves will start turning soft, and then they'll turn brown, and then they'll turn hard and crispy. And at some point they can just pop right off. They'll just separate themselves from the plant. You can remove them for aesthetics. So you don't have to keep them on there. If a leaf is going mushy or soft and it's not the very bottom leaf, or if you're noticing the bottom several leaves are doing that, that can either be a sign of some sort of bacterial infection or rot, or it could be a sign that you've got some water issues with how you're watering the plant. If it's going from the top down, that's also a bad sign. So typically you think about the plant, the older leaves will die off first. If you're seeing the top of the plant die off, you probably have gotten water inside the crown, inside that center point of the plant. And if that's the case, and it does actually get rot in there, it's done. You can't save that, unfortunately. Once that new growth area is gone, it's gone.
Questions keep coming in. Someone said they got a Phalaenopsis here at Renolda, which would have been a while ago. Had very long spikes and lots of blooms. It's now blooming with only 3 blooms per spike. Why the reduced number?
Temperature, humidity, fertilizer, light, all of the things that a greenhouse can do that you can't replicate in your home. So I know that sounds awful, but it is just the case. Sometimes it's also breeding, where you'll have a plant that will produce a really fantastic display one time, and it might take 4 years for it to do the same thing again, because it doesn't have the energy and needs to build back up its time to do that. One thing that we noticed in judging an orchid, we have to look at what we see right now. So people will bring in plants that have been judged in the past and were either passed over or got a lower award than they expected, and they bring it back in and it's either comparable to or not really better than the last time we saw it. Well, we're not going to do anything with it because it already has this, we're not going to be able to advance it further than it is. And then sometimes we'll see them bring it in a year or 2 years and it's 3 times the number of flowers, or a much larger flower, or more significantly colored, and just various little tiny changes in all of those things can cause that to happen.
Someone was asking about Phalaenopsis, any reason to fertilize or bringing them outside in the summer?
Outside in the summer, no. I would think it would be quite hot for the Phalaenopsis. So you think, 80 degrees is about their limit. So like today is about their limit. As far as temperature tolerance, they will survive higher temperatures with high humidity and more air movement so that the plant leaves themselves stay cool. But I wouldn't ever put my Phalaenopsis outside in the summer for an extended period of time. I also would make sure if you do that they're covered, because if it rains in them and you get water in that crown, the top of the plant, it can cause rot in that top growth point, and then you'll never be able to save that plant. Sorry, there was another part of that question. Was that?
And about fertilizing.
Oh, yes, thank you. So yes and no. I find some growers that never fertilize that have great success, and I find other growers that fertilize constantly that have great success. The trick, from most of the people that I know, the trick is to find a regimen that works well for you, that you can maintain, and also works for the majority of your plants. With fertilization for orchids specifically, most of them, if you're going to fertilize, if you're not buying a specific orchid fertilizer, then you'll need to cut the fertilizer strength down to a quarter. So if you're using just regular out of the box Miracle-Gro plant food, instead of whatever, it's like a teaspoon per gallon in the house, I think, use a quarter teaspoon per gallon in the house. So you cut it down to a quarter of the total volume or total measurement. And that's because orchids, generally speaking, are not heavy feeders. There are some that are, but most of them are not. Phalaenopsis in particular are not. And so you want to do this. So let's say you're watering 4 times a month. So you've got the first 3 waterings you'll fertilize. The 4th time you water, you will not fertilize at all. And that's called watering weekly, W-E-E-K-L-Y, W-E-A-K-L-Y. So your week fertilizer 3 times, and the 4th time, no fertilizer. And you do that so that any salts or buildup can be leached out of the plant on that 4th time, because most orchids do not like all of the fertilizer salts to be built up in their media. So you do the leaching so that doesn't happen as fast.
I'll just do a couple, there's just a few more, and then I think we'll cut it off. Would propane gas from a fireplace affect buds?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So anytime you've got propane or even natural gas sources that can be putting out that into the air, even if it's minimal and doesn't hurt you, it absolutely can affect buds. I, over my gas fireplace this winter, had an orchid, and I put up there just for display for fun. And within probably 2 weeks, all the flowers were gone. Because it instead of that plant would probably last 4 to 5 weeks normally. So I mean, it does cut that significantly. Ethylene gas from ripening fruit can actually cause the same problem in your kitchen. You've got a bowl of apples next to your orchid, same thing can happen. So they are quite sensitive.
Powdery insects, which I'm assuming might be mealybugs. How do you fight
Mealybugs?
Flamethrower?
Yeah, mealybugs are the bane of all plant growing existence around here. I feel like 90% alcohol and a Q-tip, and you just sit there and rub them down. You can use pesticides if you so choose. I try not to unless I absolutely have to. Yeah, the only trick is removal, and the problem with that is there's probably eggs, and you can't remove the eggs because you can't see them. So it's you have to just kind of be really on it for a really long time and get them under control. That's why I always recommend quarantine before you put a plant next to all your other stuff. Bring it home, put it in a place where it can be by itself. Once you know it's clear, then you can move it. Because if you get that infection or that pest and everything else, it's a lot harder to deal with 30 plants than it is to deal with one plant.
Yeah. I guess the last, I'll do this as the last, because I think we've touched upon the others. The last question was about, they have 3 fairly new epiphytic orchids and plan to bring them outside soon. Any advice about keeping them healthy in winters? Just the recommendations that you give.
I assume they're not leaving them outside for the winter. So
I would hope not.
yeah, so I mean, some will be fine, but most would not tolerate our winters. So again, I'm also assuming they're in pots because most people grow that way. The one we're looking at here is mounted on a piece of cork, but so if they're in a pot, you know, the same, depending on what, it's hard to say without knowing what specific plants they are, which genera they are. I'm going to assume Phalaenopsis and assume they're in pots, and then you've got, you know, all of these same rules apply. So you're looking at decently shaded, east or west window with a curtain in the winter. Your watering schedule isn't really going to change in the winter. You may have to water less often just because the plant won't absorb as much water as quickly. But that you'll know that by looking at the media or touching the media or feeling the weight of the pot. Temperatures may be a little lower. Again, for Phalaenopsis to flower, you want to have that kind of sustained cooler temperature in the late autumn. Humidity is going to be the same year round for these guys. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it should. And I will say that we've got this recorded, so if you need to go back and review your notes, it'll be there on the Gardens YouTube channel. But I think this is a great jumping off place, and hopefully you get some more people excited about orchids. I'm dipping my toe into it and buying a different one each time and saying, okay, which one don't I kill? So.
I think we started with 12 and we have over 500 now. So, and we grow in the house exclusively. So, yeah, it's a drug.
Yeah, I was going to say, that you just removed that thing about, well, it could be drugs. Well, drugs might be safer. But
sometimes.
Yeah, but that definitely when I came here, it was like, okay, I've put off diving into orchids for so long, but I gotta know a little bit about what I'm talking about. So, Will, I really appreciate your time today, and I really hope that as we move forward with the greenhouse, what great things are to come for that. I think it'll be fun working with the Triad Orchid Society, and maybe give you a more fitting home meeting at.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, good things on the horizon. So Thank you again, and thank everyone. Remember, a plant sale is coming up. Next week is the highlights of the plant sale. And if you've got any questions, just reach out to me. If I need to share Will's email, if you've got some further questions on the orchids, I'm happy to do that. But everyone have a great day. Be sure to drop by the gardens. I'm telling you, the bulbs are looking fantastic right now. So I'm going to go jump outside real quick before I jump into yet another Zoom meeting. But thank everyone. Thank you, Will. Have a great day and enjoy the spring. Thank you.